Sometimes in order to go forward in an investigation, you have to go back to the beginning. And once I did, I realized we have missed something huge, y'all. Crocs on the ground, and you're never gonna believe what I just found.
That clip takes us back to the beginning of the search, because according to the material presented, an original MDMR report states that Captain William Freeman contacted a master sergeant and instructed them to locate and interview a female subject. That subject was identified as Lanie. At first, that sounds like a routine investigative lead, but there was something unusual about it. According to the account presented, Lanie reportedly had not seen Nolan in more than a year and was believed to have been on a different island. So why did her name appear in that report? Now, that does not mean Lanie was involved in Nolan's disappearance. Nothing in the material we have establishes that. What it tells us is that, very early in the search, investigators were given a name they considered important enough to follow up. So before we decide what that name means, we need to go back to the morning when all of this was happening. According to the report discussed in the material, assistance was requested from Captain Freeman as part of the drone search on July 5th. Freeman was transported to Horn Island at approximately 10 o'clock in the morning. He attempted 3 drone launches. All 3 failed because of what was described as a software problem that could not be fixed in the field. At approximately 10:30, Freeman requested assistance from Smith. Freeman and another officer then went to pick Smith up and transport him to Horn Island. And according to the timeline presented, the first drone did not successfully take flight until approximately 12:40. And this is where another piece of the morning begins to overlap with the first report.
According to one of the original MDMR reports, Captain William Freeman called the Master Sergeant and told them to locate and interview a female subject. And that's how we get to this girl, Lanie. Now, this has always bothered me because I'm like, why is Lanie's name in this report? Why was she brought up at all? Especially since, according to Lanie, she hadn't seen Nolan in over a year and was on a completely different island. So it never made sense to me. And then it effing hit me. So according to this report, on July 5th at 9 a.m., assistance was requested from Captain Freeman as part of the drone search. Freeman was transported to Horn Island, and at approximately 10 a.m. he tried 3 failed launches. It ended up being a software error, and he was unable to fix it in the field. So then at 10:30, Freeman requests that Smith come out and assist with drone duty. Freeman and another officer went and picked up Smith and transported him to Horn Island. But by 12:40, the first drone finally takes flight. Now, wait a minute. If Freeman was out on Horn Island trying to do this drone launch, had to call in assistance, go and get that person, bring them back to Horn Island, then when the F did he get this information about Lanie? Oh, wait, I have an idea.
Was looking for Nolan, who was on the boat. Was it multiple boats? Multiple boats. Okay, can you explain that? Who was out of this group? Who was on what boat? Or who was on a boat or not going out looking for Nolan?
So, me, Wyatt, and Trayson got in the boat. We got in the Palm Beach that morning, the morning after, and to the islands, and we were met by a DMR. There was 7 DMR boats already out there, DMR and park rangers. We talked to them, we gave them all of our information. They personally asked if any of us were on the boat with him that day. We told them yes. They just said, all right, well, we got the area scoped out. And then after that, we just went up to the beach. I think we met up with y'all. Yeah.
Okay, so by Morgan's own words, he, Trayson, and Wyatt were on the Palm Beach out at Horn Island talking to MDMR. Oh, and when was that? When did they do that?
From 9:45 to 11:50, 12 o'clock era, about lunchtime. While we were on the water, we talked to a rescue guy.
Oh, you were out there until 11:50, you say? You mean 5 minutes before this phone call happened? Does that sound like a coincidence to you? Now, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility to conclude that they were the ones who gave this information to Captain Bill Freeman. Again, why would they give Lanie's name if she wasn't there in that group that day? Especially when he was supposedly last seen with Katie, whose name, again, is conveniently absent from any report that we've seen. Now, this is is about to get deep, y'all, because I reread the line again, now knowing that the boys were the ones who probably gave this information and not just some random good citizen. Specific wording says, Captain Freeman said to locate and interview a female subject that was possibly involved with the missing person on Horn Island. Possibly involved? How did I miss that? How did we all miss that? Because there's 2 other boys mentioned in this that they don't make contact with, and it just says possible names associated with Wells. That is very different and intentional language. Now, as I've told y'all, I've spent weeks learning the dynamics of all these different friend groups and who they're friends with online, etc. Now, this is Lanie. Now, most people have clocked this picture where Lanie is with a girl who is wearing the same swimsuit last 4th of July as the one that is on the boat with Katie. I'm going to try and do this in the easiest way possible. I have narrowed down the BFF group with Lanie and these girls. All of these girls have called each other their best friends and taken pictures with each other at some point or another. Now, none of these girls are friends with any of the Wyatt Warren friend group. All of them are friends with Tristan and Tristan's sister. Tristan's sister has best friend picture relationships with all of these girls. It's very clear that this is a core group of friends. There's group pictures with them, they've lived together, etc. Now, Kendall is the one in the blue and red bikini in this picture. But I found another picture of Bailey and Maggie here from last 4th of July wearing the exact same red and blue swimsuit that Kendall was wearing. So it's pretty safe to say that these girls coordinated all wearing the same bathing suit. Also found this picture of Lanie from 2 4th of Julys ago wearing this bathing suit. Does it look familiar to anybody? That's right, that is clearly the same bathing suit from the boat with Katie, with a face that's conveniently been blurred. Now, do we think it's a coincidence that 2 swimsuits associated with this friend group all ended up on the same boat as Katie? I'm gonna say the chances are slim. Now, Kendall seems to have a longtime boyfriend. And guess what his name is? Jacob Brooks, which is the second name that comes up on this report. And guess who seems to be Lanie's longtime boyfriend? Drew Johnson, the other name on this report. Now, Drew, unlike all of these people over here, Drew is friends with the Warren Wyatt friend group. Also the only one out of this entire group that is Facebook friends with Nolan. If this was the boys telling this information to the captain, why were they saying that their buddy's girlfriend was possibly involved with Nolan? And why would Tristan be snitching on his sister's friends like this? Now wait, one of Katie's BFFs, Nevaeh, is friends with a Caden McGrath. Caden is friends with 0 people from either group except for Nevaeh, as far as I can tell. Caden is somehow related to a Joe, who is frequently advertising on his page for the Biloxi Bay RV Resort. The one that I was saying that according to the GPS coordinates looks like they may have dropped somebody off at. So in my opinion, Joe is clearly somehow related to the Marty McGrath, who was the one who apparently took all these people on this boat, including Katie, when this friend group was supposedly left on this island. And I feel like that language is really important and overlooked because left makes it sound like your ride left without you. Now, according to Joe's LinkedIn, he is IT for the Ocean Marine Group, which is owned by Jerry Adkerson. Aiden is also the only person I can find who is friends with Captain Chris Seth Ward, the son of Chris Ward, who was called by Jerry to cancel the sea tow allegedly on his private line before the sea tow call was even finished. I also found a very weak connection through social media between Lanie and a girl who is in the same sorority as the girl who threw the party, Ava, allegedly threw the party. So what if Tristan's slick comment wasn't about Katie at all? Because I don't know about you guys, but we have seen absolutely 0 proof that Katie was actually out there with them. They have kept the story hyper-focused on Katie, and no other girls' names have really gotten out. What if Katie has been the red herring this whole time? I don't know. I'm still trying to piece through. I'm still trying to figure it out because there's clearly a chunk that is missing out of this story. Like, I think Lanie is a red herring too, don't get me wrong, because I don't see these boys like freely offering up their motive or anything. But it sounds like maybe this Lanie girl was involved with Nolan behind her boyfriend's back at some point, and they tried to...
The account presented says Morgan, Tristan, and Wyatt traveled by boat toward the islands the following morning. They reportedly arrived while multiple DMR boats and park rangers were already searching. They spoke with authorities and provided information about themselves. The account places them on the water during the morning, approximately from 9:45 until around lunchtime. For a moment, put those two timelines beside each other. Freeman was dealing with the drone search during the same general period that these men were reportedly out on the water and speaking with people involved in the search. And according to the material presented, a call involving Freeman occurred while they were reportedly still in that area. That is where the story takes an interesting turn. Where did the information about Lanie come from? Where did the information about Lanie come from? One possibility is that people already in the search area passed information to Freeman. But that is only a possibility. The material provided does not prove that Morgan, Tristan, or Wyatt supplied Lanie's name. That would require evidence such as call records, interview transcripts, radio communications, dispatch records, or another contemporaneous document showing exactly how the information reached Captain Freeman. So for now, that connection remains unverified. But there is another detail in the report that makes the name Lanie even more intriguing. The wording used to describe why investigators wanted to find her. The report reportedly described the female subject as possibly involved with the missing person on Horn Island. Those words immediately changed the tone of the question, but they still do not tell us exactly what investigators meant. Possibly involved does not necessarily mean investigators believed that person had committed a crime. It could refer to a number of investigative possibilities. A witness, a person who had information, someone who had contact with Nolan, or simply someone whose relationship to the missing person investigators needed to understand. To understand that phrase, we would need the surrounding report, the source of the information, and the results of whatever interview or follow-up investigators conducted. And that leads to another question. Was Lanie actually the person investigators were interested in, or was her name simply one lead among several? Because the same material reportedly contains other names. Jacob Brooks, Drew Johnson. If the wording surrounding those names is different, that could tell us something about how investigators categorize the leads. But that is something the documents would have to establish. This is where the creator moves from official reports into photographs and social media relationships. She identifies a group of young women whom she says appear to have close friendships with Lanie. She also discusses photographs from previous 4th of July celebrations and compares swimsuits appearing in those photographs with clothing visible in another photograph connected to Katie and the boat. The creator's theory is that some of the women may have coordinated their swimsuits, and that similarities between those images could potentially connect people from different social groups. That is an interesting lead. But it is also exactly where an investigation can become vulnerable to confirmation bias. A matching swimsuit may suggest that two photographs involve the same person. It does not, by itself, establish when the photograph was taken, who was wearing the clothing, whether the clothing was actually the same item, or what that person's presence would mean for Nolan's disappearance. Those questions require verification. The original photographs, their metadata, if available, the dates they were posted, statements from people who were actually present, and, most importantly, independent evidence placing individuals at specific locations. Because there is a major difference between saying, these people appear connected online, and saying, these people were together at the relevant location and time. The first may be demonstrated through social media. The second requires considerably more. The creator also spends considerable time mapping relationships between different groups of friends. She suggests that Lanie's social circle overlaps with Tristan and Tristan's sister, while another group is associated with Wyatt and Warren. She also identifies romantic relationships and social media connections involving several people mentioned in the report. This creates a potentially useful investigative map, but friendship is not evidence of criminal involvement. A boyfriend appearing on a report does not prove his girlfriend was involved in Nolan's disappearance. A Facebook connection does not establish physical proximity, and knowing someone in another social group does not establish participation in whatever happened to Nolan. What these relationships can do is help investigators understand who knew whom, and that can become important when reconstructing a timeline. Who was communicating? Who was together? Who knew about Nolan's movements? Who had access to boats? who was on the island, and who might have been able to provide information to investigators. Those are much stronger questions than simply asking who was friends with whom. There is another detail the creator considers important. She points out that Nolan was reportedly last seen with Katie, yet, according to the material she reviewed, Katie's name was apparently absent from the reports she examined, while other names appeared. If that characterization of the records is accurate, it deserves clarification. But there is an important caveat. We do not know from the material provided whether the reports discussed represent the complete investigative record. A name being absent from one report does not necessarily mean investigators never documented that person elsewhere. Reports can have different purposes. Different investigators can record different information. And early reports can change as new evidence comes in. So rather than concluding that Katie was deliberately excluded or that someone else was being protected, the more responsible question is, what did investigators know at that specific moment, and why was each person's name recorded the way it was? That is a question the documents could potentially answer. And now we have the central puzzle. On one side, there is an early report containing names and language that appear to deserve closer examination. On another side, there is a morning timeline involving search personnel, boats, and people who were reportedly communicating with authorities. And surrounding all of it is a network of friendships and relationships that may help explain how information traveled. But none of those pieces, standing alone, tells us what happened to Nolan. The real value is in determining whether they intersect at the same time, same place, and same communication chain. If someone gave Captain Freeman information about Lanie, there should potentially be a record of how that information reached him. If the people on the Palm Beach spoke with authorities that morning, their statements should potentially be compared with the official timeline. If the report described Lanie as possibly involved, the surrounding investigative notes may tell us what that phrase actually meant. And if Katie was central to the events investigators were reconstructing, her absence from a particular document needs to be understood rather than simply interpreted. Because the next question is bigger than Lanie. Who was actually supplying information to investigators during those critical first hours? And can the records tell us exactly when each piece of information entered the investigation? That is where we go next. The morning search is where the timeline begins to tighten. But once you start following the names appearing around Nolan, another question becomes impossible to ignore. How much did the people surrounding Nolan know, and when did they know it? Because a disappearance does not happen in a vacuum. There are usually movements before the disappearance, conversations before the search, and relationships that investigators have to untangle afterward. In this case, the names appearing in the early material seem to form several overlapping circles, and one of those names takes us back to Lanie. According to the material presented, Lanie was connected socially to a group of young women who also appear to have connections to people within the wider circle surrounding Nolan. At first, that might sound like background information, but remember what happened earlier. Lanie's name was reportedly significant enough that Captain Freeman wanted someone to locate and interview her. So now the question is no longer simply why her name appeared. It becomes what relationship, information, or connection caused investigators to put her on their radar so early. And there is one way to begin answering that question, by following the relationships outward. The creator's research identifies a number of friendships between Lanie and other girls in the group. Some of those girls appear connected to Tristan and Tristan's sister. Another name, Kendall, becomes relevant because of a relationship with Jacob Brooks. Jacob's name, in turn, appears in the report discussed earlier. Then there is Drew Johnson, identified as Lanie's longtime boyfriend, whose name also appears in the same investigative material. And unlike some of the others, Drew reportedly had a social media connection to Nolan himself. That does not establish anything criminal, but it changes the map. Suddenly, the question is not about one isolated person named in one report. There appears to be a chain of relationships connecting several people whose names appear around the investigation. And whenever a case contains a complicated social circle, investigators have to determine whether those connections are meaningful or simply the normal result of people living in the same community. That distinction matters enormously, because if Drew knew Nolan, that could help explain how information traveled between different groups. If Jacob was connected to another person in the same circle, that could establish another possible communication pathway. But none of those connections tells us what anyone actually said. For that, we need to return to the morning of the search. The boat becomes one of the most important pieces of this story because it gives us something that friendships alone cannot provide: a physical location. According to the account presented, Morgan, Tristan, and Wyatt traveled toward the islands on the Palm Beach. They encountered DMR personnel and park rangers already conducting the search. They reportedly provided information and were asked whether any of them had been on the boat with Nolan that day. That question is significant. It tells us that investigators were already trying to establish who had physically been with Nolan and who had not. And that means the identities of people on boats were not simply social details. They were part of the reconstruction. Who was on which boat? Who left the island? Who remained behind? And who could account for the movements of the others? Those questions become especially important because the creator's research raises another possibility involving the people who were reportedly left on the island. If that account is accurate, the wording matters. Being left somewhere can simply mean being separated from the group, but it can also raise a much more basic question. Who was responsible for transportation, and why did that arrangement change? To answer that, we need to follow another set of names. One of those names is Caden McGraw. According to the social media research presented, Caden appears to have a connection to Nevaeh, who is identified as one of Katie's close friends. The significance of that connection is not that Caden knew Nevaeh. The significance is what the creator found when following the network further. Caden's connections reportedly lead toward another person, Joe, whose social media activity includes references to the Biloxi Bay RV Resort. The creator then connects Joe to Marty McGraw, who she says was associated with the boat involved in transporting people. At this point, the story can become very easy to overstate. A social media connection between two people does not establish that they coordinated anything. A shared acquaintance does not establish that someone was physically present. And a business connection does not establish involvement in Nolan's disappearance. But the chain is still worth documenting because it gives investigators something concrete to verify. Who owned the boat? Who operated it? Who was aboard? What time did it leave? Where did it travel? And are there independent records that can confirm those movements? Those are questions that can be answered with evidence. At this stage, it would be tempting to turn every business connection into a sinister clue. But that would take us away from what matters. The important issue is not that someone worked for a particular company or knew someone associated with a particular resort. The important issue is whether those connections can establish access, movement, communication, or timing. If a person had access to a boat, that may matter. If a person was physically present during the relevant window, that matters. If a person communicated with someone involved in the search before certain information appeared in an official report, that matters even more. And that brings us back to Captain Freeman, because the unanswered question from Part 1 has not gone away. Who supplied the information that put Lanie's name into the investigation? The strongest way to approach this case is to stop looking at the names individually and start putting them on a clock. At approximately 10 o'clock, Freeman was reportedly on Horn Island working on the drone search. At approximately 10:30, assistance was requested. Meanwhile, according to the account presented, people connected to the search were already moving around the area by boat, and by approximately 12:40, the first drone was finally airborne. That gives us a narrow period in which information was being collected, communicated, and recorded. Now imagine what could happen if we obtained the underlying records. Call logs could show who contacted whom. Radio records could establish communications between search personnel. Boat records or witness statements could establish movements. The original MDMR reports could reveal who wrote down each name and when. And interviews could tell us whether the people involved remember receiving or providing the information. That is how this story can move from speculation to something testable. Because while Lanie's name appears early, another name seems strangely difficult to place within the material being examined. Katie. According to the creator's research, Nolan was reportedly last seen with Katie. Yet the early documents being discussed apparently contain other names, while Katie's name does not appear in the same way. That does not prove Katie was deliberately left out. It does not prove investigators ignored her. And it does not prove anyone was trying to redirect attention toward another woman. But it does leave us with a question that deserves an answer. If Katie was central to the last known timeline, where is her account in the earliest documentation? What did she tell investigators? When did she tell them? Who else was present when that information was provided? And did her account change as the search developed? Those questions are far more important than trying to decide from social media who looks suspicious, because a real timeline has to survive scrutiny from multiple directions. The creator raises an intriguing theory. What if Katie became the center of the story because attention was naturally drawn toward her, while another person or another part of the timeline received less attention? That possibility cannot be established from the material we have. But it is worth asking why certain names became prominent while others remained in the background. In an investigation, attention itself can become misleading. The person everyone is talking about is not necessarily the person who holds the missing piece. And the person whose name appears only once in a report may turn out to be completely innocent, or may simply have information that investigators needed to verify. That is why the documents matter. They give us a way to separate the story people remember from the information investigators were actually working with at the time. At this point, several pieces of the puzzle are sitting on the table. We have an early report that reportedly directs investigators toward Lanie. We have a timeline placing Captain Freeman on Horn Island during the drone search. We have an account placing several people connected to Nolan's wider social circle on the water during that same general period. We have photographs that may provide clues about who was connected to whom. We have a network of friendships and relationships that crosses between groups. And we have a question about why some names appear in early documentation while others appear to be missing. None of this solves Nolan Wells' disappearance, but together, these details tell us something important. The story is bigger than a single photograph. It is bigger than a single friendship. And it may be bigger than the names that receive the most attention. Because the real mystery may lie in the space between the people, the boats, the phone calls, and the reports. And there is still one major piece we have not fully examined: the movement of the people and boats after they reached the islands. If we can establish where those boats actually went, who was aboard them, and whether those movements match the accounts given afterward, we may finally be able to test some of the theories that have grown around this case. And that is where the investigation gets much deeper. By now, the story has taken us through reports, boats, friendships, photographs, and a series of names that seem to overlap in ways that are difficult to ignore. But there is a danger in a case like this. When enough individual clues begin pointing in the same general direction, it becomes very tempting to connect them all. And that is exactly where we have to slow down. Because the question is no longer simply, what looks suspicious? The question is, what can actually be proven? And when we return to the timeline, one thing becomes clear. The most important evidence may not be found in a social media photograph at all. It may be found in the records created during those critical hours. Remember the original question. Why did Lanie's name appear in an early report? According to the material we've examined, investigators were instructed to locate and interview her. The report reportedly described her as someone who was possibly involved with the missing person on Horn Island. But we still don't know who supplied that information. That missing link matters, because if we could identify the source, we might understand why Lanie suddenly became relevant. Maybe someone who knew Nolan mentioned her. Maybe someone on the island gave investigators her name. Maybe investigators had already received information about her from another source. Or maybe the wording in the report has been interpreted differently from what investigators actually intended. All of those possibilities remain open. And that is why the next piece of evidence should not be another social media theory. It should be the original investigative record. Who wrote the report? When was it written? Who was present when the information was received? Was the information firsthand? And what happened after investigators were told to locate Lanie? Those answers could completely change how we understand this part of the story. There is another reason the boat timeline deserves so much attention. People can misremember conversations. They can misunderstand relationships. Social media photographs can be misleading. But physical movement is different. If a boat left a particular location at a particular time, there may be ways to establish that. Witnesses may remember seeing it. Other boaters may have encountered it. Search personnel may have documented its location. Phone data may place passengers in a particular area. And if any official tracking information exists, it could potentially provide an independent timeline. That is what makes the boat such an important part of this story. Not because being on a boat means someone did something wrong, but because it gives investigators a way to test people's accounts against the physical world. If someone says they were in one place at 10 o'clock, but independent records place them somewhere else, that matters. If several people give accounts that match the available records, that matters too. Evidence does not only confirm suspicion, sometimes it eliminates it. And that distinction is incredibly important here. Then there is the question of who was left on the island. The wording discussed in the creator's investigation has drawn attention because saying a group was left somewhere can sound very different from simply saying they remained behind. But language alone cannot tell us what happened. We need to know who arranged transportation, who was operating each boat, who decided when people would leave, who stayed, who returned, and whether the people involved gave consistent accounts afterward. If those details can be independently established, the story becomes much clearer. And if they cannot, then the uncertainty itself becomes part of the investigation. Because sometimes the most revealing part of a case is not what the available evidence proves, it is what the evidence still cannot explain. We've also spent considerable time looking at the relationships surrounding Nolan. And there is a reason for that. The creator's research suggests that people from different social circles may have been connected through friendships, siblings, romantic relationships, and mutual acquaintances. That could be completely innocent. Young people often have overlapping social circles. Someone can know someone who knows someone else, without there being anything unusual about it. So we should not turn a network diagram into a criminal conspiracy. But relationships can still help answer one important question. Who had access to information? If Nolan knew someone who knew another person involved in the search, information could travel quickly. And in the first hours after a disappearance, that can be extremely important. Someone might hear something from a friend. That person might call another person. That person might speak with a search official. And suddenly, a name appears in a report. The chain can happen innocently, or it can reveal something investigators need to examine. The only way to know is to reconstruct it. And then we come back to Katie. The material presented suggests that Nolan was reportedly last seen with her, yet the creator has raised questions about why her name does not appear in the same way in certain early reports. That discrepancy should not be used to accuse Katie of anything, but neither should it simply be ignored. If Katie was one of the last people known to be with Nolan, her timeline should be one of the easiest things to establish. Where was she? When did she last see Nolan? Who was with them? What happened immediately afterward? Who did she contact? And when did investigators first speak with her? Those are the questions that can either strengthen or weaken the theories surrounding this case. Because if Katie's account matches independent evidence, that tells us something. If other evidence contradicts it, that tells us something too. The same standard has to apply to everyone. Lanie, Drew, Jacob, Tristan, Wyatt, Morgan, and every other person whose name appears in this investigation. Nobody should be treated as guilty simply because their name appears in a report or photograph. So where does that leave us? We have a disappearance. We have an early search operation. We have a report that reportedly directs investigators toward Lanie. We have a narrow window in which search personnel were moving, communicating, and collecting information. We have boats whose movements may help reconstruct that morning. We have photographs and social media relationships that raise questions about who knew whom. And we have gaps in the publicly discussed timeline that remain unresolved. But we do not have enough evidence to turn those gaps into conclusions. And that may be the most important point of this entire investigation. A mystery is not solved simply because several clues seem to fit. They have to fit independently. The timeline has to work. The locations have to work. The communications have to work. The statements have to hold up. And the evidence has to survive questions that could point in the opposite direction. Because there is always another possibility. Maybe the connections we have been examining are meaningful. Maybe they are ordinary. Maybe Lanie's name was included because investigators had legitimate reasons to speak with her that had nothing to do with wrongdoing. Maybe Katie's absence from a particular report is simply a feature of how that document was written. Maybe the boat movements will ultimately confirm the accounts given by everyone involved. Or maybe they will raise even more questions. We don't know yet. And pretending that we do would only make the investigation weaker. But one question still stands above all the others. What happened during those critical hours when Nolan disappeared? And who knew what before the official search began? Because if we can reconstruct those hours minute by minute, we may finally understand why certain names appeared, why certain people became part of the story, and why other names seemed to disappear into the background. The creator's investigation gave us a trail. The reports gave us a timeline. The photographs gave us possible connections. The boats give us physical movement, and the unanswered questions tell us where the next evidence needs to be found. For now, there is no responsible way to say that these connections prove a hidden explanation. They don't. But there is also no reason to stop asking questions, simply because the answers are uncomfortable or incomplete. Sometimes the truth is found in the dramatic discovery, and sometimes it is found in something much smaller, a timestamp, a phone call, a boat location, a report written at the right moment. So if you have been following this case with us, look back at the timeline one more time. Look at the names. Look at the movements. And most importantly, look at when each piece of information entered the story. Because the biggest question may not be who was suspicious. It may be who knew something first. And until that question is answered, the Nolan Wells timeline remains unfinished. If you have followed the evidence this far, tell me what you think. Which part of the timeline deserves the closest examination? The early report, the boats, the photographs, or the missing pieces in the witness accounts? Because sometimes one overlooked detail is all it takes to make an entire timeline look different.